Hello, this is Sana Hashmi, and this week in my Friends Eye on China column, I dug into the Chinese discourse on the US attacks on the oil tankers that were carrying the Indian crew. So, in the aftermath of the US strikes on vessels carrying Indian crew near the Gulf of Oman and the Strait of Hormuz, a very different narrative has been taking shape on the Chinese internet, primarily amplified by the Chinese state media. So rather than focusing only on the incident and focusing on the US and why it happened, much of the discussion has moved to India's response. And there has been a lot of analysis on how India responded and why it responded in a way that it did, and what that response might say about its foreign policy constraints. And on Chinese social media, specifically Weibo, the hashtag Indian oil tankers attacked by the US drew millions of views. And fairly quickly, the conversation moved beyond the incident itself to a bigger question: how India manages its relationship with the United States while continuing to present itself as an independent, autonomous, rising power. And a recurring theme in Chinese commentary has been the gap between the seriousness of the incident and what is seen as India's relatively restrained reaction. And some posts on Weibo describe Washington's position as deliberately uncompromising. And there was one post that put it bluntly that the message from the US was essentially that attempts to challenge restrictions or blockades would be met with force. And then others focused on what they saw as Prime Minister Narendra Modi's silence, contrasting his image as a decisive, high profile leader with what they described as noticeably muted response from New Delhi. And in fact, on the Chinese media, there was this idea that most of the time Prime Minister Modi is seen as a strong man. So why this time his response towards the US attack was so muted, was silent? And one headline went further, suggesting the timing of the strikes just ahead of the summit that is going to happen between Prime Minister Modi and Trump. And they believe that it was politically telling. And then it argued that India had effectively absorbed the incident without public escalation, despite the loss of the lives of the Indian crew. And beyond these immediate reactions, Chinese strategic writing pushes a broader line of argument. And that is India's multi alignment approach, engaging simultaneously with the US, Iran, Quad, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is described as offering limited leverage when a crisis actually hits. So the core idea there is that strategic flexibility in India's foreign policy is not really translating into influence. And from this perspective, India is seen as struggling to meaningfully shape the behavior of either Washington or Tehran. And the incident is treated as highlighting a gap between what are India's ambitions and its real world capabilities. So there have been some Chinese analysts who are taking this further, and they're trying to explain from their perspective why India has responded the way it has. And one of the more detailed interpretations come from Ting Kang, who's a senior fellow at Runman University, who argues that India's dependence on the United States is underestimated and is talked about less than it actually is. And then it runs through three main areas: military, economic, and geopolitical. So, on the military side, he points to India's increasing reliance on the US defense systems built up over 2 decades of cooperation. And according to this view, that creates long-term dependencies, not just in buying equipment, but also in maintenance, logistics, and operational capacity. On the economic front, he highlights India's push to become a global manufacturing hub and to attract supply chains moving out of China. And that strategy, he argues, depends heavily on access to Western markets, especially the US, which makes escalation with Washington economically risky for India. But then the third factor, geopolitical factor, he stresses that the US sits at the center of India's broader balancing strategy, particularly in relation to China. That in turn narrows down India's space to openly confront Washington. And this argument amounts to what he says, that any stronger response to this tanker attack would carry cost well beyond the immediate crisis itself. So there is also a more structural line of analysis that situates the incident within India's maritime vulnerabilities. And this includes its heavy reliance on imported crude oil, limits in long range naval support capabilities, and ongoing stability across key sea lanes in the Indian Ocean region. So, short term risk, the argument goes, can be managed through rerouting and diplomatic coordination, but longer term resilience would require deeper energy diversification, larger strategic reserves, and stronger water naval capabilities. So, still, this is not the only way to interpret, to understand India's response. The dominant framing in much of the Chinese commentary tends to treat restraint as weakness and autonomy as something that only shows itself through confrontation. That leaves little space for other readings of how diplomacy actually works in practice, specifically in India's case. And from India's perspective, the approach in this case fits a more familiar pattern, that is, keeping communication channels open, managing tensions carefully, and avoiding rapid escalation that could widen the crisis. And this has been India's response for such a long time. And that has worked to India's advantage as well. So now you can also see that pattern, of course, in India's dealing with China, with other countries as well, where even in periods of heightened tension, the preference has also have always been for sustained dialogue and calibrated responses rather than public confrontation, particularly from the highest level of leadership. And even when the situation was so tense with China, Prime Minister Modi did not really come up with any statement. He remained silent and he let diplomacy take its own course, and how Foreign Minister, Defense Minister took charge there. So this has been India's policy for a very, very long time. So the difference here really comes down to interpretation. From my perspective, of course, much of the Chinese commentary reads the episode through a US China competition lens, where India appears constrained by external alignments and structural dependence. So they see India through the geopolitical great power rivalry, where India does not really have a lot of agency. So what they believe is that the US is using India as a pawn, and India is not responding to the US tanker in a way that they hoped that India would have, is primarily because India does not have much of the leverage here. But I don't think that's true. The answer lies in somewhat what India practices is quiet diplomacy. And in this reading, India's response is less about absence of agency and more about a specific form of statecraft that we have been saying and that has been operating within a very difficult yet carefully managed set of constraints. So I think it's about focusing on long-term interest and managed stability rather than just issuing statements that are going to jeopardize development that have taken in the past year. So of course, the Chinese interpretation is misleading, is a little flawed when it specifically when it comes to India-US relationship. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.